Would you give up a kidney to get out of prison a little sooner? It's what one state is considering, but does it go too far? Plus,
they took an FBI informant, inserted him into the racial justice movement, and not only encouraged violence broadly, encouraged these protests to become more violent, but also tried to entrap specific activists in crimes.
Did the feds try to infiltrate Black Lives Matter? Here are the new claims being made by a podcaster who says he has proof. And a former white student at Howard Law is suing the school for racial discrimination and $2 million. But does he have a case? Welcome to the Griot. I'm Ebony K. Williams. So check this out. There is a bill in Massachusetts that would allow prison inmates to reduce their sentence if they donate their organs or bone marrow. Now, critics, of course, question the ethics of the legislation, calling it a form of organ harvesting. But supporters say that it could help more people who are waiting to receive a transplant. The bill proposed by two Democratic members of the Black and Latino Legislative Caucus would allow inmates to reduce their sentences by up to a year. I want to bring in Elizabeth Matos. She is the Executive Director of Prisoners Legal Services of Massachusetts. It's an organization that fights to protect inmates' civil rights. Elizabeth, thank you so much for being with us. Now, State Representative Judith Garcia, a Democrat, is behind the bill. Now, she says that this legislation could actually help Black and brown communities, her logic being that we are incarcerated at higher rates due to our neighborhoods being over-policed, and that this fact thins out the pool of possible organ donor matches, leading to us waiting longer for these organ donations. Now, some folks argue that this bill is extreme and that it forces prisoners to choose between their organs or their freedom. What's your reaction?
Well, we had a similar reaction, and thank you so much for having me and for focusing on this really important issue. Of course, people who are incarcerated are in a very difficult environment under very strenuous conditions and have family members and loved ones, including their own children, who they haven't seen and are unable to see as a result of their incarceration. Most people are pretty desperate to leave those circumstances. So having an option like this is in essence coercive and can lead to some very problematic scenarios, especially for a population that is disproportionately suffering from mental health issues and from other chronic illnesses.
Indeed, and we're going to get into some of those other residual side effects of this thing in a second. But just even the fact that shocked me, Elizabeth, when I read it beyond the ethical questions, was just a year reduction doesn't seem like a lot. I used to be a criminal defense lawyer, and most of my clients were looking at a whole lot more than 1 year. If you're looking at 25 years, for instance, that doesn't even seem comparable to what we're asking, or this bill at least would be asking people to give up, right?
I think that's a great point. Giving up an organ is a pretty major thing to do. And a year off of someone's sentence who's doing 20, 30 years or more is not all that significant. And another thing to consider is, would that incentivize the person to donate more organs because they have more time on their sentence? And we certainly wouldn't want to encourage that for pretty obvious reasons.
No, that's beyond a slippery slope there. Now, again, proponents of the bill would say it's voluntary, Elizabeth. Nobody's being made to do that. But you used a specific word earlier, which was coercive, and I'd like for you to just give us a little bit more explanation around how, even if voluntary, there's a coercive element that you say.
Sure. So, I mean, it's complicated, right? And I think Representative Garcia and the other representative, Gonzalez, who filed this legislation, understand that there are some serious modifications that need to happen to the legislation, and they are fully on board with that, which is great. But in terms of the coercive element, even though the language was carefully crafted to say that it's voluntary, we're dealing with people who are in a very particular power dynamic. And again, when you're that desperate and you have limited options, and you're being offered an opportunity to reduce time off your sentence. Like for some people, you gave the example of people doing longer sentences, but there are people doing shorter sentences, and donating an organ could very well be a major incentive to getting out and seeing their children. We have many, many women in particular who are incarcerated who are doubly impacted by the fact that they may lose custody of their children and cannot spend time with their children. I know if I were in that situation, I would do pretty much anything to see my kids again. And so I think we have to think about those situations, similar to how the law has dealt with sex between correctional officers and incarcerated people, no matter what the consent is, being non-consensual. It's a similar dynamic in that you don't have a situation where somebody can really give informed consent when they're placed in a situation like that.
Mm-hmm. And Elizabeth, does it matter to you at all that the architects of this bill are people of color themselves? Some people will look to that fact and say that, you know, there must be some presumed benefit to Black and brown communities. What do you say to that?
I would say, you know, it's a complicated issue. I want to say that I respect the effort to really get at an issue that is far broader, of course, and cannot be rectified by focusing on the incarcerated population. We really need to look at how to look at systemic responses to a much bigger problem. And I applaud their willingness to try and do something about this issue and the fact that there is insufficient access to organs, especially for BIPOC people in our communities.
We got a lot more questions, so stay with us. On the other side of this break, this actually isn't the first time lawmakers have tried a bill like this. We're going to see how things turned out in another state seeking to trade organs for reduced prison sentences. Stay with us.
The Griot, stories powered by us.
Watch our shows live every weeknight on the Griot cable. Check your local listings.